Imagine waking up each day to a world where danger lurked around every corner, where disease was a relentless companion, and survival was an unending battle against forces far beyond your control. This is the reality of medieval times, far harsher and more brutal than the romanticized tales of knights and castles often suggest. While many picture the Middle Ages as an era of chivalry and epic quests, the truth is that for most people living in those centuries, life was often a grueling struggle against poverty, violence, and despair. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, was marked by social upheaval, harsh living conditions, and a pervasive sense of uncertainty. Disease outbreaks like the Black Death wiped out entire populations. Famine was a frequent visitor, and warfare was a constant threat that could destroy communities in the blink of an eye. Peasants toiled endlessly on their small plots of land, often barely producing enough to feed their families. Lords and monarchs wielded power with little regard for the suffering of those beneath them, and the rigid class structures left little room for upward mobility. Even the most basic aspects of medieval life were fraught with difficulty. Homes were drafty and crowded, sanitation was virtually non-existent, and medical knowledge was primitive at best. Simple infections could become deadly, and childbirth was perilous for both mother and child. Education was a privilege of the few, leaving the majority of people in ignorance, vulnerable to superstition and misinformation. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval society continued to function, innovate, and evolve. People found ways to cope with their harsh realities through community bonds, religious faith, and a deep resilience born of necessity. But to truly understand just how brutal medieval life was, we need to peel back the layers of myth and nostalgia and confront the shocking realities head-on. From the grim conditions of peasant life and the terror of rampant diseases to the brutal nature of medieval warfare and the oppressive social hierarchies, this story will reveal the dark truths hidden beneath the surface of medieval history. It's a tale of hardship, endurance, and survival in a world far worse than you can imagine. Let's start by looking at the very foundation of medieval existence, the struggle to survive on the land. The vast majority of medieval people were peasants, bound to the land under the feudal system. Their days began before dawn and ended long after sunset, filled with exhausting labor in fields that were often infertile and plagued by unpredictable weather. The tools were rudimentary wooden plows, sickles, and hoes, and the methods archaic, meaning that agricultural productivity was low and harvests were fragile. A single bad season, a drought, a flood, or an early frost could mean starvation for entire villages. The concept of surplus food was rare. Most families lived hand-to-mouth, dependent on what they could grow or raise. There was little to no security, no safety net for the sick, the elderly, or the unlucky. The communal nature of medieval villages did provide some support, but it was fragile and could quickly unravel under stress. To make matters worse, medieval Europe was no stranger to famines. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 devastated large parts of the continent, resulting in mass starvation and death. Crops failed repeatedly, livestock died, and the desperate turned to eating anything they could find, even resorting to cannibalism in some horrific cases. These famines weakened populations, making them more vulnerable to the outbreaks of plague that would soon follow. Speaking of disease, medieval times were plagued by epidemics that decimated populations with terrifying speed. The most infamous of these was the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347 and wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population within just a few years. The plague was merciless and indiscriminate, killing young and old, rich and poor alike. Medical understanding was so limited that people often believed the disease was divine punishment or caused by evil spirits. Physicians tried ineffective and sometimes harmful remedies, while public health measures were primitive and largely useless. Sanitation in medieval towns and villages was another nightmare. Waste was often dumped into the streets or rivers, contaminating water supplies and spreading disease. There were no sewers or organized waste disposal systems. People lived in cramped quarters with animals, compounding the filth and making the spread of infections easier. The smell and sight of disease-ridden environments were part of everyday life. Medieval warfare added another layer of brutality to an already harsh existence. Battles were violent, chaotic affairs with high mortality rates. Armies were often composed of poorly trained peasants, forced to fight for their lords. Sieges could last for months, during which entire towns could starve or be destroyed. The code of chivalry and honor, often celebrated in stories, was frequently ignored in practice, replaced by looting, rape, and murder. On the social front, medieval society was rigid and hierarchical. The feudal system divided people into clear classes, with little opportunity for mobility. Serfs were legally bound to the land and their lords, subject to harsh taxes and arbitrary justice. The nobility enjoyed privileges that the majority could only dream of, while the church wielded enormous influence, often controlling education, law, and even thought itself. Women in medieval times faced particular hardships. Their lives were largely defined by marriage, childbirth, and domestic labor, with little legal or economic power. Mortality rates for women in childbirth were alarmingly high, and their voices were largely suppressed in public and political life. Witch hunts and accusations of heresy often targeted women, adding terror to their already precarious existence. Despite this grim picture, medieval people found ways to create community and culture. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and storytelling provided moments of joy and hope. Craftsmanship flourished in towns, and new technologies slowly emerged. But none of this erased the brutal day-to-day reality for the vast majority. Understanding the true horror of medieval life forces us to reconsider many romantic notions and face the cold, harsh truths. It also allows us to appreciate the resilience and ingenuity of those who lived through it, making it possible for us to survive and thrive in the modern world. The conditions under which medieval people lived were stark and unforgiving. Most of the population, peasants and serfs, dwelt in tiny villages, scattered across the countryside, where their homes were little more than crude shelters constructed from wattle and daub, thatch, and timber. These houses were cold in the winter and hot in the summer, with dirt floors that turned to mud in the rain. Space was limited, and families often shared these cramped quarters with livestock, which was both a necessity and a source of persistent discomfort. The close proximity of humans and animals bred diseases and made hygiene difficult to maintain. Inside, the hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth and a place to cook. Yet, it was far from the cozy image we might imagine. Smoke from the open fire often filled the room because chimneys were rare, causing respiratory problems and irritating the eyes. The furniture was minimal, usually a few rough wooden benches and tables, with straw or rushes strewn on the floor for bedding. Blankets were scarce, and clothing was handmade, coarse, and insufficient to protect against the harsh elements. Water sources were limited, and drinking water was frequently contaminated. Villagers collected water from wells or streams, but these were often polluted by runoff from animal waste or human sewage, which was commonly disposed of in nearby ditches or directly into the streets. This practice contributed heavily to outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and typhoid, which thrived in such unsanitary environments. For many, falling ill with such infections meant a slow and painful death, as medieval medicine was both primitive and based largely on superstition. Health and medicine in the Middle Ages were a mixture of folk remedies, religious faith, and early scientific attempts. The majority of medical knowledge came from ancient texts written by Greek and Roman physicians. But by the medieval period, much of this knowledge was misunderstood or misapplied. Speaking of disease, medieval times were plagued by epidemics that decimated populations with terrifying speed. The most infamous of these was the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347 and wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population within just a few years. The plague was merciless and indiscriminate, killing young and old, rich and poor alike. Medical understanding was so limited that people often believed the disease was divine punishment or caused by evil spirits. Physicians tried ineffective and sometimes harmful remedies, while public health measures were primitive and largely useless. Sanitation in medieval towns and villages was another nightmare. Waste was often dumped into the streets or rivers, contaminating water supplies and spreading disease. There were no sewers or organized waste disposal systems. People lived in cramped quarters with animals, compounding the filth and making the spread of infections easier. The smell and sight of disease-ridden environments were part of everyday life. Medieval warfare added another layer of brutality to an already harsh existence. Battles were violent, chaotic affairs with high mortality rates. Armies were often composed of poorly trained peasants, forced to fight for their lords. Sieges could last for months, during which entire towns could starve or be destroyed. The code of chivalry and honor, often celebrated in stories, was frequently ignored in practice, replaced by looting, rape, and murder. On the social front, medieval society was rigid and hierarchical. The feudal system divided people into clear classes, with little opportunity for mobility. Serfs were legally bound to the land and their lords, subject to harsh taxes and arbitrary justice. The nobility enjoyed privileges that the majority could only dream of, while the church wielded enormous influence, often controlling education, law, and even thought itself. Women in medieval times faced particular hardships. Their lives were largely defined by marriage, childbirth, and domestic labor, with little legal or economic power. Mortality rates for women in childbirth were alarmingly high, and their voices were largely suppressed in public and political life. Witch hunts and accusations of heresy often targeted women, adding terror to their already precarious existence. Despite this grim picture, medieval people found ways to create community and culture. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and storytelling provided moments of joy and hope. Craftsmanship flourished in towns, and new technologies slowly emerged. But none of this erased the brutal day-to-day reality for the vast majority. Understanding the true horror of medieval life forces us to reconsider many romantic notions and face the cold, harsh truths. It also allows us to appreciate the resilience and ingenuity of those who lived through it, making it possible for us to survive and thrive in the modern world. The conditions under which medieval people lived were stark and unforgiving. Most of the population, peasants and serfs, dwelt in tiny villages, scattered across the countryside, where their homes were little more than crude shelters constructed from wattle and daub, thatch, and timber. These houses were cold in the winter and hot in the summer, with dirt floors that turned to mud in the rain. Space was limited, and families often shared these cramped quarters with livestock, which was both a necessity and a source of persistent discomfort. The close proximity of humans and animals bred diseases and made hygiene difficult to maintain. Inside, the hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth and a place to cook. Yet, it was far from the cozy image we might imagine. Smoke from the open fire often filled the room because chimneys were rare, causing respiratory problems and irritating the eyes. The furniture was minimal, usually a few rough wooden benches and tables, with straw or rushes strewn on the floor for bedding. Blankets were scarce, and clothing was handmade, coarse, and insufficient to protect against the harsh elements. Water sources were limited, and drinking water was frequently contaminated. Villagers collected water from wells or streams, but these were often polluted by runoff from animal waste or human sewage, which was commonly disposed of in nearby ditches or directly into the streets. This practice contributed heavily to outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and typhoid, which thrived in such unsanitary environments. For many, falling ill with such infections meant a slow and painful death, as medieval medicine was both primitive and based largely on superstition. Health and medicine in the Middle Ages were a mixture of folk remedies, religious faith, and early scientific attempts. The majority of medical knowledge came from ancient texts written by Greek and Roman physicians. But by the medieval period, much of this knowledge was misunderstood or misapplied. The manor, the lord's estate, was the primary unit of economic and social organization. It encompassed the lord's residence, farmland, forests, and the village where peasants lived. Each peasant family was allotted a small plot of land to cultivate, but this came with heavy obligations. A significant portion of the harvest was claimed by the lord, often leaving families with barely enough to survive. In addition to tending their own land, peasants were required to work on the lord's domain, sometimes for several days a week, maintaining fields, roads, and buildings. Failure to meet these demands could result in harsh punishment, including fines, imprisonment, or even physical violence. The daily life of a peasant revolved around the agricultural calendar. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops consumed nearly every waking hour during the appropriate seasons. The work was backbreaking, carried out with primitive tools under the merciless sun or in the chill of early mornings. Beyond farming, peasants also kept animals like chickens, pigs, and sometimes cows, which were essential for food, labor, and trade. But animals also brought diseases, attracted predators, and required care that added to the endless workload. Food for peasants was monotonous and lacked nutrition. The diet consisted mainly of coarse bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and sometimes grains, and occasionally cheese or eggs. Meat was a luxury rarely afforded, except during festivals or for the Lord's table. Hunger was a constant companion, especially in years when harvests failed due to bad weather or pests. The consequences of famine were devastating, weakening bodies and making populations susceptible to disease outbreaks. Religion was a central pillar in the lives of medieval people. The church wielded immense power and influence, not only spiritually, but also politically and economically. The majority of medieval people were deeply religious, believing that their suffering was part of a divine plan and that salvation awaited in the afterlife. Priests were often the only literate members of the village, and the church was the center of community life, hosting baptisms, marriages, funerals, and festivals. Religious doctrine taught obedience and acceptance of one's social role, reinforcing the status quo. However, the church was not always a source of comfort. It could also be a source of fear and control. Heresy, or deviation from orthodox beliefs, was severely punished. The medieval Inquisition sought out those accused of witchcraft, blasphemy, or dissent, often leading to torture and execution. Women were disproportionately targeted, especially during the later Middle Ages when witch hunts intensified. The power of the church extended to education and healthcare, but both were limited in reach and often tainted by superstition. Medieval towns began to grow during this period, offering a glimmer of opportunity beyond the strictures of rural life. Towns were centers of trade and crafts, where merchants and artisans could make a living independent of the feudal system. However, town life was far from easy. Streets were narrow, crowded, and filthy, with waste thrown into open gutters or onto the roads. Fires were a constant hazard due to the wooden buildings packed closely together and the use of open flames for lighting and cooking. Tradespeople organized themselves into guilds associations that regulated the quality of goods, training of apprentices, and protected the interests of their members. This system allowed for some social mobility, as skilled craftsmen could accumulate wealth and influence. Yet, towns were also places of sharp inequality, with wealthy merchants living alongside poor laborers and beggars. Warfare in the medieval period was brutal and inescapable for many. Lords waged wars to expand their territories or defend their rights, often dragging their subjects into conflicts with little regard for human cost. Knights and soldiers were trained to fight with lethal efficiency, and battles were marked by close combat and extreme violence. Civilians often bore the brunt of these conflicts. Villages were looted, crops burned, and populations displaced or slaughtered. Sieges were particularly cruel, with starvation, disease, and psychological torment used as weapons against defenders. Medical care during these times was limited and based largely on ancient texts and folk remedies. Hospitals existed, but were rudimentary, often attached to monasteries and staffed by monks or nuns. Surgical procedures were painful and dangerous without anesthesia, and infections were common killers. The lack of understanding of germs meant that simple wounds could become fatal. Life expectancy was low, and those who survived childhood faced a lifetime of physical hardship. Amid these difficulties, medieval people developed cultural practices that reflected their worldview and coping mechanisms. Storytelling, music, and festivals provided moments of relief and communal identity. The arts flourished in religious architecture, cathedrals, and monasteries, where craftsmanship reached incredible heights. Literature from the period reflects a society obsessed with themes of morality, death, and divine justice. In summary, the medieval world was a place of stark contrast between wealth and poverty, power and subjugation, hope and despair. Survival required resilience, faith, and often a willingness to endure unimaginable hardships. Understanding these realities allows us to see the medieval period not as a distant fairy tale, but as a raw and challenging chapter of human history, where millions struggled to live in conditions that, by today's standards, were nearly unbearable. Medieval society was a complex tapestry woven with threads of inequality, survival, belief, and daily toil. The rigid class system structured every person's place in prospects, leaving peasants, the vast majority of the population, trapped in cycles of hardship and servitude. Their lives were dictated not only by the Lord's demands, but by nature's whims, crop failures, harsh winters, and unpredictable weather that could turn a year of hard work into a year of famine. The feudal system was more than just a social order. It was an economic lifeline for the nobility, but a source of constant struggle for peasants. Under feudalism, peasants were serfs tied to the land, legally bound to serve the lord who owned the manor. This binding meant they could not leave the estate without permission, and their labor was owed to the lord in exchange for protection and the right to work a small plot for their own subsistence. However, protection was often minimal, especially when war or banditry struck. Lords might prioritize their own interests and wealth, neglecting the well-being of their peasants. Taxes and rents were crippling. Peasants paid in many forms: a portion of crops, livestock, labor on the lord's fields, and special fees for using the lord's mill, oven, or winepress. These banalities added up, leaving little surplus for the family. Peasants also owed tithes to the church, 1/10 of all earnings, further straining their already meager resources. Failure to pay could lead to harsh penalties, including the seizure of property or imprisonment. Famine was a cruel and ever-present threat. The medieval diet was monotonous and poor in nutrition, dominated by bread made from rye or barley, and watery vegetable stews called pottage. Meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for nobles or festivals. Dairy products like cheese and butter supplemented the diet but were not always reliable sources of nutrition. Seasonal shortages meant that by late winter, many peasant families faced starvation. Famine not only weakened individuals physically, but made communities vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Housing conditions among peasants were primitive. Most lived in small, one-room cottages made from wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that were fire hazards. The same room served as a kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters for the entire family. Dirt floors were common, and beds were simple straw mattresses. Heating was minimal, usually just a central hearth, making winters bitterly cold and survival difficult. Smoke from the fire often accumulated inside, due to the absence of chimneys, contributing to respiratory problems. Hygiene was minimal by modern standards. Bathing was infrequent, largely because of the laborious process of heating water and the scarcity of clean water sources. Clothes were seldom washed, leading to infestations of lice and fleas. Waste disposal was crude. Human and animal waste was often dumped outside or into nearby streams, contaminating water supplies and fostering disease. Disease was a leading cause of death in medieval times. Without knowledge of germs, illnesses spread rapidly. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 of the population. The plague spread through fleas on rats, but people had no understanding of this, instead attributing illness to divine punishment or miasma, bad air. Medical treatment was primitive. Doctors relied on outdated humoral theory and often did more harm than good. Herbal remedies and folk medicine were common, but many were ineffective or superstitious. The church's influence permeated every aspect of life. It was the largest landowner, taxing peasants and wielding spiritual authority. The clergy controlled education and knowledge, keeping literacy largely confined to religious and noble classes. For the average person, the church was both a source of solace and fear. The promise of salvation kept many compliant with harsh social conditions, while fear of damnation discouraged rebellion. Yet, religion also created social cohesion and cultural richness. Festivals, saints' days, and religious holidays were breaks from routine labor. Music, dance, and communal meals provided moments of joy in otherwise bleak lives. Pilgrimages and relic worship were widespread, reflecting deep spiritual yearnings and the hope for divine intervention. The nobility and clergy lived vastly different lives. Nobles enjoyed wealth, power, and luxury. They owned vast estates, lived in castles, and engaged in politics and warfare. Knights, trained from youth in combat and chivalry, formed the military backbone of medieval society. Their armor and weapons were expensive, and their lives were often defined by battle and service to their lord. However, chivalry was as much a code of conduct and social order as a martial ethos, often masking the brutal realities of warfare. Women's lives were strictly defined by social class and gender roles. Noble women managed households and estates, sometimes wielding considerable influence in their lord's absence. Peasant women worked alongside men in fields, cared for children, and performed domestic tasks. Across all classes, women faced legal and social restrictions, with marriage often arranged for political or economic alliances. Those who challenged norms, widows, single women, or healers, risked suspicion or persecution. Childhood was perilous. High infant mortality rates meant many children did not survive past early years. Education was limited, and usually reserved for sons of nobility or clergy. Most children learned trades from their parents, or were sent as apprentices. Life was harsh from the start, with labor expected from a young age. Town life offered some alternatives. As commerce grew, towns and cities became centers of trade and craft. Freed from feudal bonds, townspeople, merchants, artisans, and laborers had the potential to improve their status through guild membership. Yet, urban living was crowded and unsanitary. Waste clogged streets, and disease was rampant. Fires were a constant danger, destroying whole districts. Warfare dominated medieval politics. Feudal lords fought over land and power, dragging their subjects into endless conflicts. Battles were brutal, with hand-to-hand combat, siege warfare, and mercenary armies. Civilians suffered immensely, as invading armies looted villages, destroyed crops, and displaced populations. The psychological toll was heavy, with entire regions living in fear. Despite these overwhelming hardships, medieval people found ways to endure. Community bonds, religious faith, and cultural traditions offered resilience. The arts flourished in religious and courtly settings, while oral storytelling preserved history and lore. The Middle Ages were not just a time of darkness, but also a period of human endurance, adaptation, and change. The justice system in medieval Europe was not just a matter of law, but a reflection of the deeply entrenched inequalities and harsh realities of the time. Lords and nobles wielded enormous power over their vassals and peasants, often dispensing justice with little regard for fairness or compassion. Manorial courts served as the primary venues where the common folk confronted the law, but these courts were far from impartial. The lord, or his steward, acted as judge, prosecutor, and sometimes executioner, wielding control over every aspect of a serf's life. In these courts, common offenses such as theft of a few chickens, failure to pay rent, or unauthorized use of the lord's resources could lead to severe punishments. These punishments included fines, corporal punishment, or imprisonment. Even the smallest misstep could result in ruin for a peasant family, who had no real recourse or defense. The idea of due process was almost non-existent, and guilt was often presumed, particularly when accusations came from those in power. Trial by ordeal was a grim testament to the superstitious nature of medieval justice. For example, the accused might be forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were deemed innocent. But if the wounds festered, guilt was assumed. Other ordeals involved submerging the accused in water if they floated. It was a sign of guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, though many drowned in the process. These brutal methods highlight a legal system more concerned with maintaining order and authority than with actual justice. Capital punishment was common and public. Hanging was the most frequent method for common criminals, but nobles might be beheaded or subjected to more honorable deaths. Executions were public spectacles, meant as warnings to the populace. The crowd's reaction was often a mix of fear, fascination, and cruel amusement, revealing the harsh social norms of the time. Health and medicine in medieval Europe were rudimentary at best. Without knowledge of germs or the causes of diseases, people lived in constant fear of illness. Epidemics regularly decimated populations. The Black Death of the 14th century was especially catastrophic, killing between 30% and 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. Entire villages disappeared, fields lay fallow, and the social order was upended. Medieval hospitals were more places of refuge than centers of healing. Often attached to monasteries or religious institutions, these hospitals provided basic care and shelter, but lacked effective medical treatment. Physicians relied on the humoral theory, attempting to balance bodily fluids through bleeding, purging, or herbal remedies. While some herbs did have beneficial effects, most treatments were ineffective or harmful. The lack of sanitation contributed to the spread of diseases. Waste was frequently dumped into streets or rivers, contaminating drinking water and breeding pathogens. Urban areas, growing rapidly in the later Middle Ages, were especially vulnerable to outbreaks. Diseases such as cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and leprosy ravaged towns and cities. Nutrition was another critical factor influencing health. The typical peasant diet consisted mainly of coarse bread, porridge, and seasonal vegetables, with occasional meat or fish. Protein was scarce and expensive. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to infections and slowing recovery from illness. Famine was an ever-present threat, particularly during periods of poor harvest caused by bad weather, pests, or war. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the most severe, leading to widespread starvation and death. Crops failed across Europe due to excessive rain and cold, and food prices soared beyond the reach of most. Starving populations were driven to desperate measures, including theft, selling their children, and even cannibalism in extreme cases. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was immense. People faced daily uncertainty about their survival, often relying on religious faith as a source of comfort and hope. The Church's promise of salvation and eternal life was a powerful force in a world where physical life was so precarious. Socially, The medieval world was sharply divided by class and status. The nobility and clergy enjoyed privileges, wealth, and influence far beyond the reach of common folk. Nobles lived in fortified castles with stone walls and deep ditches, surrounded by lands worked by peasants who had no ownership rights. Their lives were a mix of political intrigue, warfare, and luxury. Knights, as elite warriors, were trained in horsemanship and combat from an early age, living by the chivalric code, which combined martial skill with ideals of honor and service, though the reality often included brutal violence and exploitation. Women's roles were limited by social conventions and legal restrictions. Noble women might wield some power managing estates or acting as regents, but most women were confined to domestic labor, child-rearing, and agricultural work. Marriage was typically arranged to strengthen alliances and consolidate wealth. Women had few rights to property or legal standing. Those who stepped outside societal norms risked harsh penalties, including accusations of witchcraft or immorality. Childhood was fraught with danger. High infant mortality rates meant many families lost multiple children before adulthood. Education was largely restricted to boys, especially those destined for the clergy or nobility. For most children, life was a continuation of their parents' labor, learning trades or farm work from a young age. In towns and cities, life was both a reprieve from and a continuation of rural hardships. Urban centers were hubs of trade and craftsmanship, offering opportunities for some to rise through guilds and commerce. But towns were overcrowded, unsanitary, and plagued by crime. Narrow streets clogged with waste, animals roamed freely, and fires were a constant hazard. The Black Death spread rapidly in such conditions, killing many in a terrifyingly short time. Despite these challenges, medieval people found ways to persevere. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and communal activities provided moments of joy and solidarity. The arts flourished within churches and courts, with illuminated manuscripts, music, and architecture testifying to human creativity amid adversity. Ultimately, the medieval period was a time of profound hardship, marked by injustice, disease, and social inequality. But it was also a period of resilience, faith, and slow transformation. By understanding these harsh realities, we can appreciate how far humanity has come and why medieval times were truly worse than most of us can imagine. Medieval warfare was a brutal, relentless reality that shaped the lives of millions across Europe and beyond. Unlike modern warfare, which tends to be waged with advanced technology and is often confined to professional armies and specific battlefields, medieval conflicts permeated nearly every aspect of daily existence, dragging entire populations into cycles of violence, destruction, and fear. The feudal system itself was built on a foundation of military obligation. Lords and vassals owed each other service and protection, often fulfilled through armed conflict. Knights trained from childhood to become warriors, donning heavy armor and mastering swords, lances, and the art of mounted combat. Yet, warfare was rarely glorious. Instead, it was marked by cruelty, deprivation, and widespread suffering. The tools of war were deadly and unsparing. Siege engines like trebuchets, battering rams, and catapults pulverized castle walls, reducing once safe strongholds to rubble. Armies sacked villages, burning homes, destroying crops, and slaughtering inhabitants. Peasants were caught in the crossfire, or deliberately targeted to break enemy morale. The aftermath of a campaign often meant famine and disease, as survivors struggled to rebuild shattered communities. Mercenary bands and marauding soldiers were common, and their loyalty was often as fleeting as their need for plunder. These groups operated with little discipline, looting and pillaging indiscriminately. Civilians were vulnerable to ransom, kidnapping, or being pressed into service as laborers or soldiers themselves. The psychological impact of this constant threat cannot be overstated. Entire generations grew up with the sound of war drums, the sight of smoke on the horizon, and the knowledge that death or displacement was never far away. Fear and trauma were woven into the fabric of medieval life, influencing culture, religion, and personal relationships. The church played a complex role in warfare, sometimes condemning violence, and other times endorsing it through crusades and holy wars. The promise of spiritual reward and forgiveness of sins motivated many to take up arms, intertwining faith and conflict. Yet, the brutal realities of battle often contradicted the church's teachings of peace and mercy. The nature of medieval battles themselves was chaotic and gruesome. Armies clashed in hand-to-hand combat, with swords, axes, and arrows flying amid cries of pain and fury. There was little room for mercy. Wounded soldiers were often finished off on the battlefield. Captives faced uncertain fates, ransom, slavery, or execution. The strategic importance of castles and fortifications highlighted the defensive mindset of the era. Castles were not only military strongholds, but symbols of power and control. They offered refuge during attacks, but also functioned as centers of administration and justice. Their presence was a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the ever-present threat of violence. Beyond the battlefield, war disrupted trade, agriculture, and daily routines. Markets closed, fields lay untended, and famine followed in the wake of armies. Refugees fled to towns or other regions, spreading disease and increasing social tensions. The economic impact of war exacerbated poverty and inequality, creating cycles of hardship that could last decades. Women and children bore unique burdens during times of war. With men away fighting, women managed farms, households, and sometimes even defended their homes. Yet, they were also vulnerable to violence, including rape and abduction by invading forces. Children might be orphaned or forced into servitude. Despite the horrors, medieval societies developed rituals and customs around warfare. Tournaments offered knights a chance to display skill and honor in controlled environments, away from the carnage of real battle. Chivalric codes attempted to impose ideals of conduct, though reality often fell short. The constant state of warfare influenced medieval culture deeply. Stories of heroism, betrayal, and tragedy filled the literature and oral traditions. The sense of a world under siege shaped art, music, and religious expression, reflecting both despair and hope. Understanding the pervasive and devastating impact of medieval warfare helps explain why life in this period was so precarious and terrifying. It wasn't just the battles themselves, but the far-reaching consequences, social, economic, psychological, that made medieval times worse than many can imagine. In medieval times, religion was not merely a private matter of faith, but an all-encompassing force that shaped every aspect of daily life, society, and governance. The Church's influence was vast and profound, wielding power that extended far beyond the spiritual realm into politics, education, and even the economy. Yet, this dominance came with a heavy burden. Religious dogma and superstition often exacerbated the harsh conditions of survival, embedding fear, control, and a worldview that made medieval existence even more oppressive. The medieval church presented itself as the gatekeeper of salvation, promising eternal life to those who followed its teachings and strict codes of behavior. For many, this promise was the sole consolation in a world filled with suffering, disease, and violence. The hope of a better afterlife provided motivation to endure the brutal hardships of the earthly realm. However, this hope was tightly controlled by the Church's hierarchy, which demanded obedience and conformity. Religious observance permeated daily routines. The ringing of church bells marked the hours of prayer, work, and rest. The calendar was dominated by feast days, fasts, and festivals, all designed to keep the faithful aligned with the Church's teachings. Attendance at Mass was compulsory, and failure to participate could result in severe penalties, including excommunication and extreme punishment that cut individuals off from the community and condemned their souls to eternal damnation. The clergy themselves wielded enormous authority. Bishops, abbots, and priests often came from noble families, blending secular power with spiritual influence. Monasteries were centers of learning, agriculture, and charity, but also served as instruments of control. The church owned vast tracts of land and collected tithes, a mandatory tax of 1/10 of a person's income or produce. For impoverished peasants, these tithes were an additional hardship, reducing already meager resources. Superstition and fear of the supernatural were deeply ingrained in medieval society. Without scientific understanding, people sought explanations for misfortune and divine wrath, demonic possession, and witchcraft. Natural disasters, crop failures, and illnesses were often seen as punishments from God or the work of malevolent spirits. This climate of fear led to tragic consequences. Accusations of witchcraft could arise from personal grudges, unexplained misfortunes, or social tensions. Those accused, mostly women, especially the elderly or marginalized, faced torture, imprisonment, and execution. The infamous witch hunts, which reached their peak in later centuries, but had roots in medieval times, destroyed countless lives and fostered a culture of suspicion and paranoia. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common, seen as acts of piety and means to obtain divine favor or healing. However, these journeys were perilous, exposing pilgrims to robbery, disease, and harsh travel conditions. Some pilgrims never returned home, succumbing to exhaustion or illness on the road. Religious festivals offered moments of communal relief, but they could also become chaotic affairs. Revelry, drinking, and sometimes violence accompanied these celebrations. The church attempted to regulate behavior, condemning excess and sin, but popular traditions often persisted. Education and literacy were largely confined to the clergy and nobility. Monasteries preserved knowledge through manuscript copying, but the vast majority of the population remained illiterate, relying on oral traditions and sermons to understand the world. This limited access to knowledge reinforced the church's control over information and beliefs. Religious art and architecture reflected both devotion and the church's power. Gothic cathedrals soared toward the heavens, their stained glass windows telling biblical stories to an illiterate audience. Religious iconography was everywhere, reinforcing doctrines and the presence of the divine in daily life. The intermingling of religion with governance meant that heresy beliefs or practices deemed contrary to church teachings was not only a spiritual crime, but a political threat. Inquisitions and trials sought to root out dissent, often with brutal methods. Fear of persecution suppressed free thought and maintained the church's dominance, but stifled intellectual and cultural development. Yet, despite these oppressive elements, religion also provided a framework for charity, community support, and artistic expression. Monasteries offered care for the sick and poor, and religious institutions were often the only sources of aid in times of crisis. In summary, the medieval religious worldview created a complex mix of hope and fear, control and comfort. While it offered meaning and structure, it also imposed severe constraints on freedom and survival. The dominance of the church, combined with widespread superstition, added another layer of hardship to medieval life, making survival not only a physical challenge but a spiritual ordeal as well. This climate of fear led to tragic consequences. Accusations of witchcraft could arise from personal grudges, unexplained misfortunes, or social tensions. Those accused, mostly women, especially the elderly or marginalized, faced torture, imprisonment, and execution. The infamous witch hunts, which reached their peak in later centuries, but had roots in medieval times, destroyed countless lives and fostered a culture of suspicion and paranoia. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common, seen as acts of piety and means to obtain divine favor or healing. However, these journeys were perilous, exposing pilgrims to robbery, disease, and harsh travel conditions. Some pilgrims never returned home, succumbing to exhaustion or illness on the road. Religious festivals offered moments of communal relief, but they could also become chaotic affairs. Revelry, drinking, and sometimes violence accompanied these celebrations. The church attempted to regulate behavior, condemning excess and sin, but popular traditions often persisted. Education and literacy were largely confined to the clergy and nobility. Monasteries preserved knowledge through manuscript copying, but the vast majority of the population remained illiterate, relying on oral traditions and sermons to understand the world. This limited access to knowledge reinforced the church's control over information and beliefs. Religious art and architecture reflected both devotion and the church's power. Gothic cathedrals soared toward the heavens, their stained glass windows telling biblical stories to an illiterate audience. Religious iconography was everywhere, reinforcing doctrines and the presence of the divine in daily life. The intermingling of religion with governance meant that heresy beliefs or practices deemed contrary to church teachings was not only a spiritual crime, but a political threat. Inquisitions and trials sought to root out dissent, often with brutal methods. Fear of persecution suppressed free thought and maintained the church's dominance, but stifled intellectual and cultural development. Yet, despite these oppressive elements, religion also provided a framework for charity, community support, and artistic expression. Monasteries offered care for the sick and poor, and religious institutions were often the only sources of aid in times of crisis. In summary, the medieval religious worldview created a complex mix of hope and fear, control and comfort. While it offered meaning and structure, it also imposed severe constraints on freedom and survival. The dominance of the church, combined with widespread superstition, added another layer of hardship to medieval life, making survival not only a physical challenge but a spiritual ordeal as well. In medieval towns and villages, daily life was inextricably linked with filth and disease. Streets were often narrow, crowded, and lined with wooden houses that lacked proper drainage. Waste from households and animals frequently accumulated in the streets, mixing with rainwater to create fetid pools that became breeding grounds for vermin and insects. These conditions made the spread of disease virtually unavoidable. One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval health was the lack of understanding regarding hygiene. Bathing was not a common practice among the lower classes, partly due to superstition, and partly because clean water was often scarce or polluted. Many believed that water could carry disease or weaken the body's defenses. Public bathhouses existed, but were controversial, sometimes condemned by clergy for encouraging immoral behavior, and epidemics often forced their closure. This reluctance to bathe contributed to the prevalence of lice, fleas, and other parasites that further spread disease. The medical profession itself was split between university-trained physicians, barber surgeons, apothecaries, and folk healers. University doctors were educated in theory, focusing on classical texts but lacking practical surgical skills. Barber surgeons performed operations, bloodletting, and tooth extractions but were considered lower in status. Apothecaries mixed and sold herbal medicines, many of which were based on superstition as much as science. Folk healers and midwives practiced traditional remedies, sometimes blending pagan and Christian elements. Surgical procedures were crude and painful, with no effective anesthesia or antiseptics. Amputations, trepanations, drilling holes into the skull, and cauterizations were performed in desperate attempts to save lives. The risk of infection was enormous, and most patients faced grim odds of survival. The plague, with its multiple waves throughout the medieval period, exemplified the terrifying nature of disease. During the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, entire regions lost upwards of 50% of their populations. Mass graves became common, and normal social structures broke down as fear and chaos reigned. Cities closed their gates, trade declined, and superstition flourished. Some turned to flagellation, public self-punishment to atone for sins and appease divine wrath. Others blamed marginalized groups, resulting in violent pogroms. Leprosy, another feared disease, caused disfigurement and social exile. Lepers were forced to wear distinctive clothing or bells to warn others of their presence. The stigma meant many suffered in isolation, abandoned by family and community. Despite its dread, leprosy's actual contagion rate was low, but ignorance and fear perpetuated myths. Malnutrition compounded the impact of disease. Medieval diets for peasants were limited and repetitive, often consisting of coarse bread, pottage, a type of stew, and seasonal vegetables. Protein sources like meat and fish were scarce and expensive. This poor nutrition weakened immune systems, making individuals more susceptible to infection and less able to recover. Infant and maternal mortality were tragically high. Many children succumbed to diseases like measles, whooping cough, and gastrointestinal infections. Mothers often died during childbirth due to infections or complications, such as obstructed labor, exacerbated by the lack of medical knowledge and sterile conditions. Hospitals, usually run by religious orders, served more as places of refuge and spiritual care than centers for effective medical treatment. The sick were cared for with prayers and basic nursing, but without cures for the diseases they suffered. Quarantine measures were inconsistent, and overcrowding facilitated further spread of illness. Public health efforts were minimal and poorly organized. Some cities attempted rudimentary sanitation laws, such as banning waste disposal in streets or regulating slaughterhouses. However, enforcement was weak and resources limited. The understanding of contagion was virtually non-existent, and medical responses were reactive rather than preventive. Despite these challenges, medieval society developed rituals and customs around illness and death. The sick were often seen as bearing God's punishment, and prayers for their souls were common. Burial practices reflected beliefs about the afterlife, with consecrated ground considered essential for salvation. In conclusion, the realities of medieval medicine and disease illustrate a world where survival was a constant struggle against invisible and deadly foes. The combination of ignorance, superstition, poverty, and harsh living conditions created a perfect storm that made health precarious and life expectancy short. For many, illness was as much a part of everyday existence as work or worship, and the specter of death loomed large over even the simplest of tasks. The demographic catastrophe wrought by repeated outbreaks of plague fundamentally altered medieval society in ways that echoed for centuries. The Black Death alone reduced Europe's population by an estimated 30 to 60%, a staggering blow that fractured social orders and economic systems built around large, stable populations. Entire regions saw villages abandoned, fields left fallow, and trade routes disrupted. But within this chaos lay unexpected opportunities for change. As the labor force shrank drastically, the demand for peasants and skilled workers surged. For the first time in centuries, commoners found themselves in positions to negotiate better wages and improved living conditions. This shift unsettled the feudal hierarchy, where serfs were bound to the land and subject to their lord's will. The traditional power dynamics that had upheld medieval society began to erode as peasants moved in search of work, sometimes fleeing oppressive manorial controls. Governments and nobles tried desperately to clamp down on these changes. Laws such as England's Statute of Laborers, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility. However, enforcement was patchy, and the spirit of resistance simmered beneath the surface. Revolts, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, arose from these tensions. Led by charismatic figures like Wat Tyler, peasants challenged tax policies and feudal oppression, demanding freedom and fairness. Though violently suppressed, the rebellion marked a significant moment in the slow dismantling of feudalism. The plague's impact extended beyond economics into profound shifts in social and cultural consciousness. The omnipresence of death prompted an existential reckoning. Art and literature became deeply preoccupied with mortality and the afterlife. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a potent artistic theme, depicting skeletal figures leading nobles, clergy, and peasants alike toward the grave. This motif encapsulated a stark medieval truth. No wealth, title, or piety could shield anyone from death's indiscriminate reach. This period also saw a surge in religious fervor, alongside widespread disillusionment with the church. Many turned to extreme acts of piety or self-flagellation, hoping to appease what they saw as divine wrath. Simultaneously, the church faced criticism for its failure to protect communities, fueling calls for reform. This spiritual tension laid the groundwork for movements that would culminate centuries later in the Protestant Reformation. Daily life, for the average medieval person, remained harsh and uncertain. Survival depended on navigating the intersecting threats of starvation, disease, and conflict. The agrarian economy was fragile, with poor harvests sparking famines that compounded suffering. Infrastructure was rudimentary. Roads were rough and travel perilous, limiting trade and communication. Despite these adversities, medieval communities demonstrated resilience and innovation. Towns became centers of commerce and craftsmanship, fostering the rise of guilds that regulated trades and protected workers' interests. Agricultural advances slowly improved yields, including the introduction of the three-field system, heavy plows, and better animal harnesses. These developments laid the foundation for the eventual transition to early modern economies. Education and intellectual life, although largely confined to monasteries and elite institutions, preserved knowledge and sparked curiosity. Universities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford flourished, promoting scholasticism and the study of classical texts. This intellectual awakening helped bridge the medieval and Renaissance worlds. Moreover, the trauma of the medieval period shaped societal attitudes toward health, justice, and governance. The failures of medieval medicine underscored the need for empirical observation and scientific inquiry, sowing seeds for the medical advances of the Renaissance and beyond. The repeated cycles of famine and revolt highlighted the importance of fairer laws and more accountable rulers. In summary, the medieval era's brutal hardships were a crucible of transformation. While life was undeniably worse than we often imagine, with rampant disease, violent social upheaval, and pervasive poverty, these challenges forced society to adapt and evolve. The legacy of medieval struggles is a testament to human endurance and the capacity for change even in the darkest times. The medieval period's brutal hardships were experienced by a vast spectrum of people, from the lowest serfs to the highest nobles, each facing unique challenges but united by the pervasive instability of their world. Take, for example, the plight of peasants, who made up the majority of the population. Their lives were marked by grueling labor, subsistence farming, and the constant fear of crop failure or disease. They owed tithes and labor to their lords and taxes to the crown, leaving little time or resources for rest or security. Yet, despite these burdens, peasant communities often banded together, forming tight-knit villages where mutual aid, shared traditions, and communal celebrations offered moments of reprieve from hardship. Among the nobility and knights, life was not cushioned from struggle either. The incessant warfare, whether local skirmishes or larger conflicts like the 100 Years' War, placed enormous physical and psychological strain on warriors. These conflicts drained resources and destabilized regions, often devastating the very lands they were supposed to protect. Moreover, nobles were often caught in political intrigues and rivalries that could lead to imprisonment, loss of lands, or death. The chivalric ideal, glorified in tales and poems, often masked the brutal reality of medieval combat and politics. Religious figures, monks, priests, and bishops held considerable power and influence, yet they too lived with contradictions. They offered spiritual guidance and solace to suffering populations, but were often implicated in the corruption and abuses that fueled popular disillusionment with the church. The construction of grand cathedrals was a testament to faith, but also a drain on communal resources. Pilgrimages and religious festivals provided hope and purpose, but could also spread disease and exacerbate hardship. One cannot discuss medieval suffering without revisiting the devastating impact of disease, especially the Black Death. This plague reshaped every aspect of medieval life, killing millions and leaving survivors to grapple with the psychological trauma of living in a world where death could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Entire families were wiped out, and traditional practices of mourning and remembrance were overwhelmed by scale. The repeated waves of plague across decades also caused profound economic disruption, halting trade and destabilizing markets. Yet, in this devastation, we also see the emergence of new attitudes toward death, health, and community responsibility. The plague forced society to reconsider its relationship with the natural world, hygiene and medicine, even if these lessons took centuries to fully integrate. The resilience of medieval people shines brightest in their cultural achievements. The Middle Ages produced some of the most iconic and lasting symbols of human creativity. Gothic cathedrals, such as Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, and Canterbury, stand today as awe-inspiring testaments to medieval engineering, artistry, and religious devotion. These architectural marvels were built through the hard labor and skill of countless craftsmen, often under harsh conditions. Illuminated manuscripts, intricate tapestries, and epic poems like the Canterbury Tales and Beowulf reveal a vibrant cultural life preoccupied with themes of heroism, morality, and the human condition. Medieval education and scholarship, centered in burgeoning universities and monasteries, preserved and expanded the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity. Figures such as Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy, shaping Western thought for centuries. The scholastic method, emphasizing reasoned debate and inquiry, laid groundwork for scientific exploration and rationalism, even as the Church maintained strict doctrinal control. Despite these advances, medieval society remained deeply unequal and often harsh in its treatment of marginalized groups. Women, for example, faced rigid restrictions on their roles and freedoms, with exceptions mostly found among noblewomen or those in religious orders. Peasant women labored alongside men but lacked legal rights and were subject to patriarchal authority. Accusations of witchcraft and superstition disproportionately targeted women, leading to persecution and death. Minority groups such as Jews endured systemic discrimination, expulsions, and violent pogroms, scapegoated during times of crisis. The legal systems of medieval Europe were a patchwork of local customs, royal edicts, and church law, often arbitrary and brutal. Trial by ordeal, public executions, and harsh punishments were common methods of enforcing order, reflecting a worldview where justice was intertwined with fear and spectacle. Over time, however, legal reforms began to introduce concepts of due process and rights, slowly moving toward more equitable governance. The cumulative effect of these struggles and gradual changes set the stage for the Renaissance and the modern era. The hardships endured in medieval times forged new social contracts, economic systems, and cultural paradigms. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of merchant classes, and the spread of education created conditions for increased social mobility and intellectual flourishing. In closing, the medieval era was a world of contradictions, savage yet sublime, oppressive yet transformative, dark yet illuminated by faith and creativity. It was worse than many imagine in terms of suffering and instability, but it was also a crucible in which the resilience of the human spirit was forged. Understanding this era, in all its complexity, not only honors the memory of those who lived through it, but also enriches our appreciation of how far humanity has come and how much of our modern world owes its foundations to those who endured the unimaginable challenges of medieval times.